The format's going to be a little different tonight, but I think it's going to be lots of fun and very informative. So that you know the history on this, of course, with the Dean's Lecture, we typically have a presentation and then have ample time for question and answer. This evening, there's no formal presentation. We're going to go right to question and answer, and I've got lots of questions. In fact, I've been given lots of questions already, so don't worry. And we'll kind of play by ear. You have cards if you want to fill things out, but we can also probably see how that works or whatever. But let me tell you the background for this particular session tonight. My first year as dean was the same year that this Dean's Lecture Series was renamed the W. David Baird Distinguished Lecture Series, and so what I wanted was David to make a presentation, and he put me off year in, year out, and I told him, in fact, you can make it on anything you want to do. And he still put me off, and so when we got to the History of Pepperdine book, I asked him, what about a panel discussion? And if we put that together, Pepperdine at 75. So that's really the backdrop for this. I will tell you that if this book goes really well, I'm going to take some credit for it because another person and I kept pushing and saying, you know, a historian with kind of, you know, great credentials should write the history of Pepperdine. That had not been done, and David Baird would be the ideal candidate. And so we got traction with the president, and so that's what David has been working on over the past couple of years. And so he is a wealth of information, and I think it's going to be a great evening. And so that's what's happening tonight. I'll be really brief about the three panelists we have. I think they'll be familiar to a lot of you. I've already mentioned David. David is now Dean Emeritus of Seaver College. He's the Howard A. White Professor of History. He came here. David sort of worked his career in decades, right? He was a decade at University of Arkansas, a decade at Oklahoma State, and then he had a decade at Pepperdine as a professor, and then a decade as a dean. So things worked pretty well. He is one of the leading historians on the history of the American West, and especially Native Americans. Heavily published, and in fact, one of his publications is the textbook in Oklahoma public schools on the history of Oklahoma, and so he's just a wealth of information about that. But he's been spending the last few years working on the history of Pepperdine, and so I think it's going to be a great evening for that. Jim Wilburn is the Dean of the School of Public Policy. Jim has been at Pepperdine University. I think you're celebrating 40 years this year, right, Jim?
Right.
Or Pepperdine's celebrating 40 years. We'll see. We'll know by the end of the evening if Jim is going to celebrate it as well. And one of the reasons I selected Jim was I've spent a fair amount of time now with Jim on Dean's Councils and situations like that. And he also is a walking encyclopedia. If David writes about the history of Pepperdine, Jim lived a lot of it. You'll hear that tonight, I think. It's stunning, the meetings he was in and the things that he's been involved in. And so I thought it'd really be wonderful to have people who were actually here and present and lived it. And then Priscilla McRae is a professor of sports medicine here at Seaver College at Pepperdine. And I selected her. I've known Priscilla also, and she's a wonderful scholar. But what you may not know is Priscilla also grew up on the Pepperdine campus. She came as the child of a professor. Her father, Bob Gillum, was a professor, and so they came here. And but I have, Priscilla may not even know this, I have a real soft spot in my heart for Priscilla and for her family because her mother was a realtor, and we live in the house we live in today because of her mother. Her mother said, you need to buy this house. This is the house you need to live in. And we still live there today. And so she has wonderful parents. And so I thought it would really be wonderful to have, again, someone who knows Pepperdine both as a, experienced it as a child and now as a faculty member and a scholar. And so hopefully she can reflect on that some tonight and talk about changes she's seen at Pepperdine and, great moments, not so great moments, that kind of thing. So that's how we're going to kind of lay things out tonight. I thought what we would do first, though, is let each one of our panelists simply briefly tell you their history here at Pepperdine, the experiences they had, what brought them to Pepperdine, and kind of the things, so you'd get a sense of who they are. and then I'll throw a couple of questions at them, and we'll be off and running. So, Jim, do you want to begin?
Just to kind of give you a background on myself, or
Yeah, quickly, kind of. You may have to edit everything you've done at Pepperdine. So,
I was going to say he knows how long-winded I can be. Well, as he mentioned, I've been here 40 years. I came here as a consultant to help plan the Malibu campus. No intention of coming to Pepperdine. I turned down the first 2 invitations I had to come as a fully employed faculty member. And after being here for a year as a consultant, they said, you need to come and live with what you have planned. So I taught history, eventually got tenure as a historian in Seaver College, and along the way got seduced into administration. I was executive assistant to the president, provost. In those days, there was a provost over each campus, and the provost was not just academic. In those days, you were in charge of everything from the cafeteria to the business officer to the registrar to, I did contracts on who had food service and had the people who took care of the grounds organized with the NLRB labor strike. And so as provost, you were in charge of all of that, and I did that for 3 years. For 10 years, we had 2 campuses with a full liberal arts college on both campuses, student newspaper, student government, student activities, all on both campuses. Then I became vice president, kind of the first vice president for advancement, and put together staff for that for 6 years. Resigned that, intended to go back and teach history at Seaver College, which was my first love. And before I could get out the door, I had just gotten an MBA, from Pepperdine. And I walked across the stage, got my degree, and then I walked back up at the same ceremony to be introduced as the new dean. And it's a long story. I was dean of the business school for 12 years, announced we would build a building up on the hill for the business school, and I'd never dreamed it would take 15 years to get permission to do it, but we eventually got it done. And after that, I was going to go back and teach, and I did for 2 years. I taught in the business school for 2 years, and then turned down the new job to start the School of Public Policy a couple of times, and finally told David Davenport I would do it for 1 or 2 years to get it up and running, which was 13, 14 years ago. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Good, thanks. David?
Well, as Rick mentioned, I am from Oklahoma, and I did my graduate work at the University of Oklahoma, while I was also working for a member of Congress from Oklahoma. So I did my undergraduate work at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and was in Oklahoma at the time that I finished, and so I took my bachelor's degree at the University of Central Oklahoma and then my graduate degrees from the University of Oklahoma. Went to the University of Arkansas and was there for 10 years, as Rick mentioned, and then Oklahoma State University, where I was also chair of the history department for 6 years. And then we came here in 1988 when Angela came as a freshman. Angela had decided several years before, when she was a sophomore in high school, that she wanted to come to school at Pepperdine. They'd come to California on a mission trip. You know, in Oklahoma, we send missionaries to California, and she decided this is where she wanted to come, and she was admitted, and we came out to let her and drove out so she would know just how far it was. But when they came here, she was all the more committed. But Bill Adrian was the provost, and we knew Bill because he had been at Oklahoma State University for 5 years while we were there. And the long and short of it is that they offered me the position of the Howard White Professor of History simultaneously. So we came with Angela in 1988, which is not quite what she had in mind, but nevertheless, And I held that position for 5 years, actually continuously, but then was chair of the Humanities Division for about 5 years, which really is the hardest job I've ever had on this campus. Being chair of a division is the hardest job in Seaver College, in my judgment. But did that for 5 years and then was dean for 10 years and have been, took a sabbatical for a year. And I've been working on this book for the last 2 years. And and the working title, and I can share, the opportunity presents itself, I can share some of the chapters for, but the working title is Pepperdine University, 1937 to 2012, The Quest for Distinctiveness. So the subtitle, I hope, carries some of the sort of directions that we're going.
I think mine will be a little bit shorter, just as far as my connections. Yes, we moved out here in 1969, so I was 13 years old, and Dad came out to be the chair of the Social Science Division at the new Malibu campus. So we lived over in Agora, and he carpooled many times with Ken Perrin here down to the old LA campus. And then I, of course, decided I couldn't go to Pepperdine because my dad was a professor here, so I went to Abilene Christian for the first year and a half. And Pepperdine looked better and better after a year and a half in West Texas. So I transferred and studied abroad in Heidelberg and then graduated in 1978 from Pepperdine. So I got to experience 3.5 years here as a student after being the faculty kid on the block. Went and did a master's at the University of Arizona and a PhD at the University of Texas. And every place I went, I had great experience, but again, Pepperdine looked better and better. And then came back and postdoced at USC. And at that time, Howard White was president. And so I had a chance. Ken Perrin was chair of the Natural Science Division, but he asked me what church doors I went through, and I wasn't going through the right church doors at the time. So he wasn't sure that I could be hired back, but I came and taught one course while I postdoced, and then came back in 1985. And have been here since then, except for 2 sabbaticals.
Great. Well, David, why don't you, I think there are a lot of people in this audience who will know quite a bit about the history of Pepperdine, but why don't you, well, tell us what the sections of the book are, and but also I thought it might be interesting to, when you talk about the beginnings, I've heard you say there's some unusual aspects to the beginning that may not be as much common knowledge to some, so. Well, tell us what you think we'd be interested in that we might not know.
Okay, well, I'll do that. Let me first give sort of a
Okay.
quick overview of what this would look like in terms of chapters. As I mentioned to you, let me go back to this one. My working title is The Quest for Distinctiveness. And then the first chapter is one that you would expect. This is about Mr. Pepperdine himself before 1937, the founding of the school, a man and an idea. And although I think that miracle is overworked insofar as Pepperdine history is concerned, it did occur to me that it was just as much a miracle on Vermont Avenue in 1937 as it was in Malibu in the 1970s. And so this is the account of the story of the first 2 administrations, not fully, but Dr. Baxter, and also Tyner, Hugh Tyner. And where am I here? This is Tyner, and this would go from 1946 to 1957, and the title of it would be the George Pepperdine College in Crisis. We don't really typically think of this period as a time of crisis, but it was in 1952 that the George Pepperdine Foundation went bankrupt. And from that point on, up until really 1980, the fiscal condition of the college and the university was always sort of day to day. And so this period of time from 46 to 57, I think of as the college in crisis. And then Norval Young came in 1957, and you have the emergence of a multi-campus university. Campuses at Los Angeles, in Orange County. Orange County, you had the law school, School of Continuing Education, also a host of military bases. One time it was said that the sun never set on Pepperdine campuses, and that's a bit of an overstatement, but not much of one. and then, of course, in Heidelberg, and then also Malibu. But beginning with 1968, you have what I call the Malibu Marvel, as opposed to the Malibu Miracle, and through 1978, and that's, of course, we associate with Bill Banowski by and large. And
He likes to rub it in that I had Jesse Jackson come and speak when I was provost.
That's right. I like him to remember his roots. He was this chapter has to do with the passing of the Los Angeles campus up through about 1984. And then under Howard White, necessary consolidation between 1978 and 1985, which is really the White years. And then David Davenport between 85 and 2000. And an emerging maturity during the administration of Andy Benton, which I have suggested that we move from buildings to scholars. And there are lots of different pictures of scholars that I could have submitted there, but I do think that that's something that's happened since 2000. We measure progress not in terms of new buildings, but in terms of the academy. And then finally, sort of a distinctive heritage. And there are several recurring elements that I look at, everything from Christian mission and how it's manifested, to administrative leadership, to fiscal issues, the faculty, curriculum, student body composition, the co-curriculum, athletics, the physical plant. All of that are recurring elements within the story. And then there are working themes that you may recognize. One of them has to do with the subtle cross, and which is sort of, I think, unique to Pepperdine, but tells us a lot. The strong and responsible citizenship for America and the world, the spirit of sacrifice and service, the value of the individual, globalism, relentless drive toward excellence, but also an entrepreneurial spirit, which I think still remains and is part of the character of the institution.
Thanks. Well, how about
you want me to say just a little bit about the early days?
Specifically, I've heard you talk about, at the beginning, everyone talks about George Pepperdine and the $5 and the penny postcards. I think you've talked some, though, about Lena Pepperdine.
Yes, that's right. As a matter of fact, we give too much, over the years, have given too much play to the man and the idea. And in fact, it should be Mr. and Mrs. Pepperdine and the idea. Lena Rose, whose picture was on the board just a moment ago, and George Pepperdine married in 1908. They grew up in the same community, same county actually, and went to the same church. Although he went off to sort of secretarial school, and then got his job in Kansas City, and then he came back and married her, and she went up there with him. And the idea may have been George's in terms of a catalog was concerned, but when it came to actually getting the goods out the door, it was primarily Lena who did that. And much of the success of the Western Auto Supply Company, in my judgment, was really due to her good business sense. They came to California in 1916 because of he was a tuberculosis sufferer. They came in 1916 and very quickly started a store in downtown Los Angeles, although interestingly enough, they lived in Long Beach. And they lived in Long Beach because there was a colony of very conservative Church of Christ people who lived down there. We call them Sommerites. That really means nothing to most people, but they lived in Long Beach early on, and then they would move later to Los Angeles. But the great success came in 1926 when they opened up this brand new grand building at 11th and Grand Street in downtown Los Angeles, not far from the Staples Center, and it still exists, and I showed you a picture of it a moment ago. Mrs. Pepperdine played a critical role in that happening, Lena Rose Pepperdine. And she was recognized as sort of a modern businesswoman, and she was lots of press in the Los Angeles newspapers about that issue. She was recognized as a leading woman, not only by the Los Angeles community, but by Mr. Pepperdine himself, and he would frequently say, the business person behind this operation is Mrs. Pepperdine. They called her L.R. Pepperdine, not Lena Rose, but L.R. Pepperdine, and she had a life of her own too outside. She was very active in the Women's Chamber of Commerce and other things, and she came to head up the Women's Committee for the Rose Bowl Parade, and her name was frequently sprinkled throughout. The Los Angeles Times and others. Her daughter married Francis married a guy by the name of Crosley, and they moved to Hawaii, and she took charge of the store that they created in Honolulu. So she was frequently going back and forth to Hawaii. But you get the impression that she's a very vital woman, she was an attractive woman, but at the same time you get the sense too that she didn't always appreciate Mr. Pepperdine's piety as strong as it was, and for an inexplicable reason. I think we can pretty much understand why, but it's clearly not in the record. She left the house and started sort of her own life. She resigned as vice president of Western Auto, and this was sometime in 1928, early in 1928. He went around the world in 1928 with his mother. They traveled alone, by the way. And they traveled extensively. He would take the daughters and they would do trips, usually these voyages. But they traveled alone, and she resigned and she left. And in January, and this was one of the shocks that came to me, no one had mentioned this to me. In January of 1929, he sued her for divorce, for abandonment. And abandonment is abandonment of the marital bed. She did not contest the divorce, and the divorce was granted to be effective in January of 1930. Now, in the meantime, she went on a lengthy voyage down to South America, and she and her youngest daughter, her oldest daughter, had married and was in Honolulu, as I mentioned. They went around the Horn into Buenos Aires. They bought very attractive parrots. And to make a long story short, on the way back, she caught parrot fever or pizzicosis. But she made it back in about the middle of December. She rode in the Rose Bowl Parade on January the 1st of 1930. Mr. Pepperdine presumably walked beside the car. Everybody talked about them getting back together. She left the Rose Bowl. She went to Matson's, to the port of Los Angeles, to Matson's, got on a vessel, and her condition really got bad on the route to Hawaii. She never made it to her daughter's house. She went directly to the hospital, and she was dead in about 48 hours. But the divorce never happened because it had to take place. She died before the divorce decree became final. So Mr. Pepperdine was the executor of her will. She had named him the executor, but he also got a spousal portion as well. And I'm not sure that the children, the oldest two daughters from that marriage, ever fully supported that, understood that. But my point here in mentioning this is that her contribution to the business was significant. And Mr. Pepperdine never really got into the business. He remarried in 1935. And there were some other opportunities for marriage that he didn't accept. But he married Helen in 1935, and then he sold. He established a university or college in 1937. And then he sold Western Auto in 1939, somewhere between $5 and $10 million. That's a big spread, but it's difficult to really assess. It was never a figure that was never publicly released. But his enthusiasm for business sort of left when she died. I think that's my point.
Thanks. I want to get all of you engaged. One of the questions is, it's well known today that academic excellence Christian mission are two of the key themes, and they've been themes for quite a while. I'd be interested in having you all reflect on how you've seen that in the history of Pepperdine play out. I know I've heard David say it may have been there from the beginning, but Jim, you've been here a long time. Have you seen that, and how did you see it play out at Pepperdine and the different dynamics?
Yeah, I would just, I think what we either opened with accreditation or in the first year, very unusual for a new school to become accredited almost from the very beginning. So Pepperdine, I think, had a fairly good reputation early on, and had some outstanding faculty members in the late 40s, in the mid 40s, early 50s. I guess I've always kind of felt like that we were, throughout most of the time that I've been here, that we were maybe not quite as good as our best friends think we are, but that we are better than some of our enemies think that we are. And I think we have always had some outstanding teachers, professors. In the 40s and 50s, we had some who were highly recognized in their disciplines. I'm thinking of some of our religion professors were highly respected in national organizations of biblical scholars. And probably some other disciplines as well. However, I do think that in terms of I do think that we've made a lot of progress. I guess one of the questions I'm wrestling with is how do you define academic excellence? And it may not be those who are most widely respected in their discipline. We've all had the experience of having faculty members that were really well known, that weren't very nice people, and maybe weren't very effective teachers. So I think Pepperdine has always had some very effective teachers. And I think we all feel like that we're making some progress in terms of being able to attract an Ed Larson, or some of you guys here on the front row, and some who are not on the front row. I shouldn't have said that.
That'll teach you to get to the front row.
I think we are fortunate to have Ken Waters 40 years ago, Ken, and that's I'll stop there.
Priscilla?
Well, I think that the Christian Scholars Conference this summer is a real testimony, at least in the science, to the ability to tackle the tough issues that are in the academic community and faith, and crossing over that. So I think to have the director of the National Institute of Health, Francis Collins, here on our campus and speaking freely and interacting, and the other discussions, I guess I was very encouraged because of the number of people that attended, not only from our sister churches of Christ, but for me, more importantly, from other Christian universities across the nation, Claremont schools, other that are non-Christian as well, not still faith-based. And so to me, that's, at least in our area, the sciences, I thought that was a really great, and I really appreciate the dean's support and Jay Brewster's doing that. And I think for me, the only thing I felt sad about was not more of our students were here, because I think that was an opportunity for them to see people who are known nationally, internationally, also very strong in their faith and sharing that. So.
Well, let me ask a couple more questions, and then we're going to throw it open. And I think we can, the acoustics in here are quite good, so rather than you have to write your questions, we'll just have you stand where you are. But before we get to the Malibu Marvel or the Malibu Miracle, which I think that may occupy some time, maybe David and Jim, you might be able to comment on this as well. One of the interesting dynamics when Norval Young came to be president, he came from Lubbock as a pulpit minister. And I think the story I've heard is a third of the faculty resigned. You want to talk about that a little bit? Faculty may find that intriguing.
No,
I wouldn't.
No.
Jim may want to talk later about the strike.
Yeah. In fact, that is true, or approximate truth. Norval came in 1957, but he came in the midst of a crisis that was essentially an economic crisis. in terms of the fact that Mr. Pepperdine had lost his fortune in 1952. His ability to write a check to cover the debts ceased in 1952. Through 1957, the institution was constantly running at a deficit. And in order for that, it just simply could not continue if the institution was to survive. But there was also a sort of a crisis of faith in a general sense, because E.V. Pugliese and Hugh Tyner were gentlemen who were men of great faith, but yet by the same token, it was sort of a generic faith as opposed to attachment to a particular denomination, in this particular instance, as Churches of Christ. Norval came in 1957 from Lubbock, from the biggest Church of Christ in the Fellowship of Churches of Christ, 2,000 members. And he came with the idea in mind that he would sort of save Pepperdine for the church. But he couldn't come until Tyner resigned, and Tyner resigned as a consequence of sort of a serious kind of moral issue that we can go into, and it's very titillating. I could tell you more about it, but suffice to say that it was a crisis of some proportions, and he resigned. And then when he resigned, they were able to move E.V. Pugliese out, and it was very difficult, very stressful, but nevertheless it was considered to be absolutely critical in order to save the school, not just for the Churches of Christ, which of course was part of the story, but also from a financial point of view. And so Norval came in 1957. And and where am I going with this?
So how do you keep a school going when a third of your faculty?
Oh, that's right. That's the reason I was doing that. Okay, thank you. I get caught up in the salacious part of the story.
Yeah, you've got everybody. As soon as I open it up, I know what the first question will be.
But the whole idea, insofar as Norval was concerned, was to make the school successful. Well, I really have lost my way. I got so excited about the salacious part.
Let me tell you the story I had heard was that I always kind of heard that a third of the faculty resigned, and then more recently I heard that not only did they didn't resign when he first came, but they waited until
later.
Just a few weeks before school began, and then they walked out.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
So thinking the place would come apart because they couldn't get
That's right.
faculty.
And that was 1958. When Norval came in 1957, there were those who responded almost immediately because they were so disappointed that we were taking what they considered to be a step back into the fold of the Churches of Christ. But they didn't. The largest number didn't resign until April of 1958, with only just a matter of months. And it was in that period of time that Norval probably showed some of his greatest grit, in my judgment, in finding faculty who would take the place. And it was that J.P. Sanders had come with him in 1957. Sanders was equally appreciated within the Church of Christ Fellowship as was Norval, and the two of them working together were able to attract some individuals like Howard White. Howard White came in 1958, and a host of others. And the 30 people who resigned really resigned with malice aforethought. Their idea was to bring the school to its knees. They waited until that particular day in order to do that. But in fact, Norval being the optimist that he was, and Sanders being the remarkable assistant that he was, they were able to gather together a faculty, many of which came from Lipscomb, along with Howard White, and were able to continue on in some ways better than they had been beforehand.
How about
You also had a contingency. Ken, when did you guys come? You had a group from Harding as well, but that's a little later than...
Yeah, it's 10 years later.
Yeah.
68.
So the Malibu Marvel, we'll get you all to comment on that. There is a perception that Pepperdine bailed on on LA and came to Malibu. And I've heard that there's a whole lot more to that dynamic involved. In fact, all of you anyone who wants to talk about that, the dynamics. Jim, I will have a follow-up for you because I've been told that you were at the LA campus and were not one that was terribly gung-ho about Malibu.
No, that's not true.
Okay.
It certainly is not. I mean, I'm not joking. I was, there were people, even including my assistant provost, who took great pride in the fact he had never set foot on the campus at Malibu. But I was not of that persuasion myself. I thought the Malibu program was great, and it was the future of Pepperdine, frankly. And I was scheduled to be out here when I was asked to be, it's a longer story than we have time to tell, but when I was asked to be provost of that campus, and I really accepted that as a wonderful opportunity to do what I had hoped might be. For 10 years, we had 2 campuses, and as I mentioned a moment ago, we had a complete liberal arts college there. The first 2 or 3 years of the Malibu campus, we still had a larger liberal arts college there than we had at Malibu. Seems to me we started out here with 450 or so, and we had about 1,000 still living on the campus in dorms, and we often forget that there were heroic efforts made to save that campus, and even when the decision was made to have another campus, heroic efforts were made to operate 2 campuses, and we did that successfully for about 10 years. When I became provost down there, I put together what I called an urban board. I had the leading African-American business people in town were on the board. Tom Bradley had just been elected mayor of Los Angeles. He was the chairman of my board. Mrs. Seaver was not necessarily happy about that, but he was the chairman of the board. He didn't attend all the meetings, but he always sent his chief of staff if he could not come. Yvonne Braithwaite Burke had just been elected one of the first African-American women in Congress. She was on my board. There are a number of people like that. So we made a valiant effort. People forget that the very first building that Blanche Seaver built at Pepperdine was on the Los Angeles campus. Now, if you're going to close a place down, you don't build a whole new building with plans to close it down. And anybody that says that was in the plans just don't know what they're talking about. I remember spending one full day with Leonard Firestone on that campus with Bill Benoski. We walked him around the whole campus, showed him all the plans we had for that campus and how great it was going to be to build kind of Harvard in the ghetto. And we offered to name the school the Firestone. This would be Seaver College out there, and it would be Firestone College down there. I think there's maybe something a little bit about this in the Malibu Miracle, but I remember the day that we had that meeting with Leonard Firestone. And Leonard basically said, you know, I want to help you at Pepperdine. He was a very liberal Republican who was in trouble with the right-wing Republicans around. He was a Rockefeller Republican versus a Goldwater one, and it's a long story in California politics. But and Bill Benoski said, you know, we've got a right-wing reputation. It would do you good to hook up with us, and would be us good to hook up with you. We'd both kind of be seen as more moderate. And he said, well, I want to help. But he said, your future is at Malibu. So we now have Firestone Fieldhouse. And I mention that as just one among many many efforts that we made to raise funds for that campus, to promote it. They joke with me about losing my roots as a liberal Democrat. And, you know, part of the thing I discovered in that urban board I had was that a lot of the people that I thought would jump in to help us were eager for us to stay in South Central LA. But every time money came up, they said, well, you know, isn't there a government program that we could tap to pay for this? And I didn't have many people opening their wallets. I think maybe, I mean, there were fires in the dorm about once every 2 weeks. I had to hire an undercover agent who enrolled in school. I never knew his name, but he enrolled in school, went through the whole process, was a great intelligence on how my staff would treat new students. He lived in the dorm, and he wrote me a report every week of what he was seeing in the dorm. That's how I found out who was setting the fire in the dorm. I mean, we had fire engines about once a week on campus. I lived on campus, which is fairly secure. It's behind gates, but I had armed robbery in my driveway, and came out one night. I was single at the time, and I came out to go do my laundry, and a couple of little neighborhood kids were siphoning gas out of my gas tank. I mean, it was just standard. I think, you know, we had a lot of our students going in the business school at the time were from sheriff's deputies and all, and a couple of them came around to tell me there was a prostitution ring operating out of married student housing. I decided to bulldoze married student housing. I mean, literally, I did. And Dr. Young, Norval Young, called me one day and he said, Jim, let's just give the students, you know, one day off, a holiday, and we'll buy the paint, and they can paint up, you know, Normandy. They call it Normandy Village. It was on Normandy Street. And, you know, we can still rent out those apartments. I didn't have the heart to tell him what was going on there, but so it was a tough time to try to be building a school there in the South Central LA. The coup de grace maybe for that whole effort for me was the city council member for that district, an African-American political leader, came to me one day and he said, Jim, I really like what Pepperdine is doing, and I'd like for my daughter to go to school there. She's a senior this year in high school. So I arranged for her to get a scholarship, and we set up a lot of things to make sure she deserved to be at Pepperdine. She had a good grade point average and all, but I kind of gave special attention to making sure that she had what she needed. The day before she was to enroll, I get a call from her dad, and he said, Jim, there's been a great misunderstanding. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I thought my daughter was enrolling in the Malibu program. And it just really struck me. I'm down here trying to serve this community, and the city council member who is over this district doesn't want his daughter here. He wants her at Malibu. And, you know, we just came to realize that no matter how hard we worked there, we would never have an Olympic pool or the ocean view, and students would be constantly comparing the two and thinking that their tuition was going to build a pool at Malibu or, you know, some crazy thing like that. So I decided to recommend that we close the liberal arts college there. We took some time to do it in a way that nobody lost their job. We gave them opportunities to kind of find ways. We started some new programs that kind of transitioned it. And I've always felt that maybe the most creative management job I ever had at Pepperdine was being able to phase out that program in a compassionate way and give a lot of those students and faculty opportunities to come to Malibu or find jobs elsewhere. But this myth that we somehow abandoned the inner city and traded that for Malibu is just, it's very much a myth without any substance. I've probably told too many stories already, but.
That's good. Why don't we open it up? If you have a question, stand or speak up. And Don.
I've got kind of a mundane question after these locked out. I'll let somebody else go for the salacious part. Yeah, I certainly hope somebody will. I wanted to ask about architecture in the buildings. I grew up in LA, and I was a high school student here, and actually was on that campus for a journalism conference when I was in high school on my campus. And I remember being struck, and very favorably struck, by the blue buildings, the sort of Art Deco style, you know, and I might have expected a guess I'd say, conservative church institution to be neo-Gothic or to be quasi-functional, or to have, you know, the usual machine shed Pentecostal church or something. And I was really kind of amazed at this really rather nice campus. And I don't know who the architect was. I don't know why they chose that style, whether it was, you know, automobile modern or what they were after. And certainly there was an effort to try to do something architectural here. People may have different opinions about it, but there was certainly an attempt to try to make an architecturally interesting and elegant campus. And I'm just wondering about the process in both cases, because I think nobody ever talks about the architecture down in the other campus.
Yeah. Well, I can say just a bit about it. You
Go
probably
ahead.
know more, but actually, I worked my way through all of that. And the architect, Mr. Pepperdine, didn't make the decision to build a campus until about February of 1937. And it opened in September of 1937. So all of that took place, that building took place in less than a year. They weren't quite ready when the school opened in September, and as a consequence, students had to live in hotels downtown for several weeks. And Helen Young was one of those students, and she has interesting memories associated with that. But I know the name of the architect that at least did the early buildings, and a notable Los Angeles architect who had done some of the theaters downtown. And I don't recall them offhand, but Mr. Pepperdine took care of all that himself. Insofar as the selection of the architect was concerned, and the sense of style, you know, he even though he was a Kansas boy, he had a certain sense of style, and was always willing to take advice from the professional, and to even though he didn't have that kind of sensibility about him, but it did. It was the local architect did it, and he always utilized architects, and I've got a record of that someplace. I think you occasionally see it in like architectural history books as an example of that style, and it is. I remember as a little boy, I grew up in San Diego. My father grew up in Los Angeles. He was the only member of the Church of Christ in his family, and I remember him taking me by that campus very early when I was, 4 years old, and it's very dramatic. When I became provost, I painted all the buildings a different color, more like the colors we have here, kind of a cream color, and Mrs. Pepperdine never forgave me, but Pepperdine, they call it Pepperdine blue,
yeah.
and it actually, if you could go into a paint store and ask for Pepperdine blue, they could mix it up for you.
John?
Yeah, three people that typically most still aren't aware of that really had a significant impact on Pepperdine district was Don Miller,
Yep.
George Evans,
Yep.
and Bill Teague. And they get lost in the mix of history, but I think they had extremely important roles.
Who was the second one you mentioned?
George Evans.
George
yeah,
Evans.
yeah.
Well, in fact, they play a significant part in our story. Don Miller, by the way, was on the board of trustees. Actually, Evans was on the trustees, and who was the third one, John?
Bill Teague.
Bill Teague. Bill was not. But the first two were actually on the board of trustees and played significant roles, particularly Don Miller, who for years was chair. Mr. Pepperdine was chair of the Board of Trustees for the first 10 years, 15 years, actually up until about 1956, because the revolution that took place in 1957 came as a consequence of Mr. Pepperdine sort of being forced to step aside, and Jimmy Lovell was responsible for that. And with that, then they were able to take action on removing of Tyner, and once you remove Tyner, you were able to remove Puyas. But Evans came on a little later and played a significant role as well. But Don Miller was a major player and somebody that we all owe a debt to.
Bill Teague was a vice president, and I actually remember Bill when I was a little boy. He was in the Navy in San Diego, and sometimes filled in the pulpit where I went to church. He worked. He was an assistant to the president at Abilene Christian when he first graduated from. He was an older student after World War II, and then he went to work for Benson at Harding, where they did a lot of conservative business roundtable stuff, some anti-communist stuff, and so he kind of brought that with him, and I don't know how much Norval played in recruiting him to come here, but Pepperdine did a whole series of anti-communist films and a number of things, and Bill Teague was very much involved in that. And probably if Bill Benoski had not come along, Bill Teague may have ended up as a president here after Norval. He ended up going back to, he ran for Congress in Orange County as a Republican, almost won, but did not. He went back to Abilene and eventually became president of Abilene, but he did have a huge influence until Bill Benoski showed up.
Chris?
I guess this is for anyone. I guess mostly for David. So you've obviously studied a lot about Pepperdine's history. And my sense is that institutions repeat certain patterns over time. And not only do we look at the past to understand the past, but we think about what's going to happen next. So what, based on your research in the past, what are the 2 or 3 biggest challenges that Pepperdine faces in the future? And are these recurring things that visited Pepperdine time and time again?
Good question. I'm not sure I know immediately the answer. I'd have to sort of study about it. But the thing that has impressed me as much as anything else really occurred in the 1960s as we were facing the crisis of the inner city encroaching upon the campus in South Los Angeles and what to do about it. And the response to that was really rather remarkable. And it came from Norval, who was the president, and his sense of choosing people, and I think then Bill Benoski played an important role in that. And it was their ability to take an idea and then somehow or other to communicate that idea and to get other people to buy into that idea. And then this campus is a consequence of it. I mean, and I was looking at these figures today, within a matter of 9 years, we went from a budget of $3 million to more than $30 million. And when Jim was provost at the LA campus, this was in 1973, the budget was $32 million. And he brought in, he forgets this, but he brought in 1 million of that from federal grants. Now, you wouldn't think a Republican would do that, but nevertheless, they were from federal grants. And I don't see that level. There is a certain creativity that came from that. I mean, real significant creativity that has carried through over a period of time. And I think that's, to me, that's the most sort of dramatic, is this sense of creativity. We've not done anything like that since then. When you go from a $3 million budget to a $32 million budget, and you do so just in a matter of a few years. When you go from a campus that's valued at, they sold that campus in 1981 for $14 million to Fred Price. And that a good part of that money went into our endowment, interestingly enough. But they sold that campus, and then within just a matter of years, we had a budget of $62 million. It was really remarkable, absolutely remarkable.
Yeah, I was going to say, and a part of that story is that the additional professional schools, the business school, which started, I think, in '69.
69.
I've got the enrollment records in my file. I need to get them down to the archives, but for the first years of that, and the enrollment in that doubled. Norva Young asked the business division of what was the undergraduate liberal arts college to whether or not they could start an MBA program, and they got together, the faculty, and decided there was already one at UCLA and one at USC, so there wasn't room for another one. So he went to the religion department and hired a faculty member from there to be dean, Don Syme. And so they started a new business school, and it doubled in size every year for about the first 5 years, compounded annually, just chunk. And without fairly, by the time I was dean of the business school, we had as many students at Seaver College. And we had to recruit them faster because they go through in 2 years instead of 4 years. You got to replace them more. It was a real challenge to manage that school. But I mean, the difference between what it was in 1968 and what it was in 1978, you wouldn't recognize it as being the same school, and the growth in it. I think in answer to Chris's question, the dilemma that we all live with if we're at Pepperdine of our relationship, our faith and knowledge relationship and the relationship to the churches of Christ and all, has been part and parcel of Pepperdine since the day it opened. When I was a kid, my dad was a minister, and I remember one day playing around in his office at the church building, and I kind of looking through his filing cabinet, and I remember as a teenager coming across this file that said Pepperdine University on it. And I remember reading through there, and there were articles out of the Brotherhood newspapers about Pepperdine, and it couldn't decide whether it was in or out. Was it really a Christian school or wasn't it? And I look back on that now. I wish I had that file. And my dad used to agonize over it. He grew up. His mother. He grew up without a father in Los Angeles. Grew up working with a paper route on Bunker Hill, back when it was kind of a ghetto. And he was so proud of Pepperdine, but he used to agonize over what it was going to do, if it was going to be really faithful to its mission and all that. So I think that has been an ongoing part of our tradition from the very beginning, and the fact that we are still wrestling with that, I think, is none of the other Church of Christ related schools have had that as much as Pepperdine, because they all knew kind of who they were at the beginning. All their faculty had to be Church of Christ. Pepperdine was never like that.
That's right.
And it's particularly challenging when the denomination that you are associated with can't decide what it's going to do. So where do you connect, and do you connect? And so I think that's a recurring theme. By the same token, I think that has freed up Pepperdine for a vibrant statement of faith that it could not have had it had a closer, more formal tradition. I think it's one of the marvelous things about Pepperdine. I think Pepperdine is situated today to play a role globally because of that no other school could play. And I mean, I'm sorry that I'm toward the end of my career at Pepperdine. I think it's going to be an exciting next 2 or 3 decades for Pepperdine. I think the challenge is going to be living up to what God has offered the role for us to play.
Priscilla, how about,
So
why
I'm
don't you
going to add
reflect on,
one theme to that I see recurring, and I just really feel like sometimes the feeling of a disconnect between the president of the university and the faculty. So remembering in early days, lots of discussion between Ken Perrin and my dad and other leaders at that time, fighting for salaries for us, fighting for decrease in load, fighting for research facilities, and feeling a disconnect between the president feeling like we're not working hard enough and working, and I feel like that kind of has come around again, and I think many of the faculty are feeling some of that again. So I do think that there are some things like that that we need to be attentive to and look back on, and thank people who've gone before us, who have fought some of those battles, and try to perhaps learn from what's happened in the past and not have, we've had some challenges the last few years with some of that.
Priscilla can speak more directly to that. Her dad and Bill Bonoski had good times and bad times. And I think both of them, maybe I'm being too personal here, Priscilla, I think both of them came to appreciate each other in subsequent years more than they may have when everybody was mad at Bill. Number one, Bill felt like if he couldn't pay the bills, that nobody was going to have a job anyway, so he didn't spend a lot of time with faculty. But he also went out of his way to to put that in their face sometimes. So, and I think at the end, one of the first things he did when he went from here to the University of Oklahoma was to give the faculty a raise at Oklahoma. I mean, he learned something there.
Another question?
Pepperdine, over the last couple of presidents, has had a history of the younger president and also a longer tenure for some of the presidents. How have the younger presidents of Pepperdine affected the growth and shape of the university?
I think that,
I
I don't feel like I can answer.
I feel like I'm dominating
No, go
here,
ahead.
but
Go ahead.
yeah, Hugh Tyner became president when he was 32,
Something like that.
I think 32. Bill Bonoski was 32 or 33. David Davenport, 32. I remember when I was dean of the business school, I wanted to appoint an associate dean who was like 35, and the faculty said, no, he's too young. You know, I think Pepperdine has been very fortunate and blessed because in each one of those cases, I know, you know, I've known, I didn't know Hugh Tyner well. I'd met him, but I didn't know him well. But I think all of those people made some, we were fortunate to survive their first 2 or 3 years as they were learning in some cases. But they all were very bright, very talented. When we moved to Malibu, 2 of our major donors, our 2 largest donors, the Seavers, Richard Seaver and Richard Scaife, both put up some money to hire McKinsey to come in and do a management audit of Pepperdine. And I know from Bill Bonoski that he was afraid, you know, they were saying, a bunch of Church of Christ preachers can't manage this thing anymore, it's too big. But I think there is something about working hard to build a congregation of 2,000 people in Lubbock, Texas, and raise money for the building. And Norval Young was noted nationally, internationally. We were proud of him if you grew up in the Church of Christ in those days because he made Time magazine. I mean, it was just great. And I really think there is something about the tradition that these people have come from that have permitted them to do some of the things they've done, in spite of the fact that they maybe don't have an MBA. But so I think the youth of our, and even Howard White became young after he became president at 65. For one thing, he changed his registration from Democrat to Republican.
Well, insofar as students are concerned, you're absolutely right. I mean, they're here for 4 years and they sort of move on, but there are patterns that do develop, and I think it's possible, for example, to follow through on some of that. But you know, essentially, and I've been worried about this and troubled about it, but essentially, you know, it has to be a story of leadership and circumstances surrounding that leadership. And so as a consequence, you hear more about presidents, you hear more about the vice presidents, executive vice presidents, and deans than you hear about faculty. There are faculty exceptions to that, however, that you can point to, and students that you can point to as well. But you know, essentially what you're trying to do, at least I'm trying to do, is to take 75 years, and in order to get through it, you have to skim the cream off the top, and you just look at trends as opposed to individuals. Unfortunately, it's not, and that to that extent, it's almost ahistorical. It's more social science. And I don't even want to, you're more looking at the group rather than at the individual exception to it. But I don't, I just, it's essentially a story of direction. And essentially it's a story of leadership and exceptions there too. And there are lots of exceptions. Lots of clay feet insofar as our leaders are concerned. And can I share some of those? Moral failures. And I don't go out of my way to point those out unless they have some consequence for the institution as a whole. But there are those. And I mean, it's more relevant if those moral failures are associated with your leadership than with a member of the faculty. And you know, there's not anything that's done by the leaders that isn't replicated by the faculty under any circumstances, but yet it doesn't affect the overall direction of the institution quite like that. And there are some moral failures.
Can I ask another question?
A follow-up?
Not related. This goes back to what Jim said earlier about, hey, I have this file of stuff, and maybe I ought to send it your way. But tell us a little bit about the kind of the state of our archives and our
Well, I'm pleased to tell you. I'm pleased to tell you that they're in a mess. And fortunately, we've had presidents who had a sense of history, particularly Howard White. So we have good work, good papers from Howard, and those are in the library. They're poorly processed. I mean, they're not processed. Bill Banowski's papers, his personal papers, the university secured those several years ago. They've been processed. They've been well processed. They've been minutely processed, too processed, as a matter of fact. I have the Young papers, but those just came out of the Young garage within the last 18 months. And so we've worked our way through those with some effect, with some good effect, but you know, we probably missed some things too. But nevertheless, and he has presidential papers and chancellor's papers, and it's pretty easy to separate those things out. But we had wonderful papers. I shouldn't say wonderful, I never saw them. But we had substantial papers for President Baxter and for President Tyner that were in the president's house up over the Brock House, in the Brock House. But unfortunately, the last president, when he left, destroyed those. Which, well, I won't get started on that. But he did. He destroyed those in his own personal papers.
Wow.
So right now I'm inundated with papers up through 1984. thereafter it gets pretty thin. In part because the nature of an archive changes, as you know, from paper to electronic. But that's a transition period. That didn't really become significant until the 90s. So it's a very interesting process. We've got, and we've just hired an archivist who will be able to do something with that. So right now I think that the most significant contribution I'm making is not so much the narrative as the footnotes. And I love that situation where you know, your test of membership in the fellowship is your footnote. And this one has lots of footnotes in it. And in many ways, that's the biggest contribution I think that we're making.
Mike?
Missteps and moral failings aside, there's, I think, for many of us here, there's something special about this place, and our sense of affinity and our sense of tie to this place, I think is unique. And I would be interested in hearing from each of you, kind of, what is it that ties you to Pepperdine, and what is it that kept that sense of affinity and sense of passion for this community?
I guess I think of a couple of things. One is I don't know how to really deal with this without being too personal, but I started life as a very young full-time minister and decided that that was not what I was intended or cut out to do. And through a number of wanderings around, I feel like I kind of rediscovered a role of faith in my own life at Pepperdine. And I think that Pepperdine is a welcoming place for people who are not, you know, cut out of the typical mold of a particular group, but nevertheless take their spiritual concerns seriously. And I think that's one of the things that has kept me here, though I have resigned with the intent of leaving several times along the way, and just didn't quite get out the door before there was another job that looked interesting. The other thing that I've often said, and this is kind of maybe a funny analysis, but my feeling, I sold real estate for 1 year. I decided that I found that I was working on my dissertation more than I was selling, and I thought that said something about my career choice, that I was in the wrong place. But I did enough to kind of know what that's like. And I've often compared my years at Pepperdine like being 40 years selling real estate in an up market. When you're selling real estate in an up market, you know, you think you're smart. And it's really just that anybody could be doing it. And I have felt that every job that I had at Pepperdine was just a wonderful opportunity to do something. That reason I've not taken opportunities at other universities is because I would go look at them and think they would never let me do what Pepperdine will let me do. And I just think that this is a place where if you have a great idea, something you feel passionate about, there's an opportunity to bring it to fruition. And so the faith thing and the fact that Pepperdine is welcoming to people who like to be educational entrepreneurs.
I think for me, it started really with having a teacher take personal interest in me. So Lori Nelson, you know, asked me to be a teaching assistant in human anatomy, and then sort of misfortune, or now I see good fortune, Proposition 13 came through, and there were no teaching jobs in California. And so Dr. Nelson said, you really should think about graduate school. And so then a whole new world opened up. And I still think that's what we're unique about, is we care about students. We see the unique qualities, potential in them, and the ability to speak that into their lives. At the same time, they may not be performing up to their potential, but to be able to do that. And I think, you know, Lori still does that as she tries to get our students into different health professions. And then I think secondly is, you know, what you shared, this, the freedom to share our faith, and hopefully in a way that challenges people. We're not afraid of questions, but at the same time, we encourage people in all of our failings, which we're going to have. We are all people of clay at times in our lives. And so I think for me, it continues to be that of challenging us to excel in our gifting at the same time, being forgiven when we don't do that, and being able to disagree. I think that's one of the things I appreciate most, is being able to disagree and still at the end of the day be friends and know that we're working for the same cause, and that's to make this place a great place for students.
David, we'll give you the final word.
Oh, my. Well, my sense is very much shaped by my own family background and my discipline in history. I came here because it was a Church of Christ school, and it was, although interestingly enough, it was because it was a particular kind of Church of Christ school that sort of drew me here. And that continues to be a special blessing to me from personally. I know about Bethany College. I know about Alexander Campbell. I know about Barton Stone and all those kinds of things. And so there's something about that that's very powerful for me. And but yet on the other hand, I never attended a Christian college until I came here, and was very proud of it. But somehow or other over the years that sort of changed, and now I identify with the institution, but it's a unique institution, and it's sort of because of that I am where I am, and take pride in the fact that this is an institution that's associated even loosely with the churches of Christ. But that's a nationalist part of me that is fairly mute on most occasions.
Well, let's thank all our I want to thank you all for coming. I know you had lots of options tonight for places to go. There's a lot going on the campus. And if you recall, this is just number 2 this fall. We've got another one coming next week, and then a 4th one coming. So we very much appreciate your attendance. And again, I want to really thank our panelists for this evening and for being willing to share what they know and their experiences with us. So we are dismissed. Again, thank you for coming.